Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm Maki Park, Senior Policy Analyst for Early Education and Care at the Migration Policy Institute, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. This webinar's title is Addressing Trauma in Young Children in Immigrant and Refugee Families Through Early Childhood Programs. I need to go over a few quick logistical notes before we get started with the conversation. First, if you are running into any technical difficulties now or over the course of the webinar, please email us at events@migrationpolicy.org or call us at 202-266-1929 so we can help you out. We also wanted to let you know that we will be holding a question and answer period at the end of the call. This will not be a voice Q&A, but will be moderated via chat. So please type any questions into the Q&A or chat box on the right side of your screen and send to the host or to myself. You can also email questions to events@migrationpolicy.org. Alternatively, if you are on Twitter, you can tweet your questions to @migrationpolicy or use #MPIDiscuss. And these questions can come in over the course of the webinar, so no need to wait until the end of the presentation to send those in. So my MPI colleague and co-author, Associate Policy Analyst Caitlin Katsiafikis, and I will be speaking about the issue brief that we are releasing today, and we are privileged to have the opportunity to be speaking alongside our presenters, Jessica Dym Bartlett, Co-Director of Early Childhood Research at Child Trends, and Amy Hilado, Founding Manager of the RefugeeOne Program. I will be introducing both of our distinguished speakers momentarily, but first wanted to give you all a bit of an introduction and context to the topic of our discussion today and an overview of the issue brief that we are releasing. So we are hosting this webinar here at the Migration Policy Institute's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy, where our work covers a range of issues impacting immigrant and refugee outcomes here in the U.S. For Caitlin and myself, our work at MPI focuses on early childhood policies that promote the healthy development and success of young children of immigrants and refugees and dual language learners. We at MPI have been excited about the rising interest and visibility of the issue of trauma across the early childhood field. However, we've been seeing little focus in either research or practice looking specifically at the overlay of the issue of early childhood trauma with the needs of immigrant and refugee families and what some of the specific and unique challenges of this population might be. As you may know, we ran a brief webinar series looking specifically at opportunities to address infant and early childhood mental health issues for young children of refugees, and we are releasing today an issue brief that looks not only at the refugee population, but young children of immigrants as a whole, bringing attention to the lack of resources and programs responding to their needs, and pointing to potential opportunities to improve policy and practice, particularly in the early childhood fields. So I did want to begin setting the context by giving you all just a few coordinates about young children of immigrants and refugees at a national level to paint a quick portrait of their size and share in some of the key characteristics that concern us in relation to the issue of early childhood trauma. Children of immigrants, who we define as all young children who have at least one parent who is foreign-born, now comprise 1 in 4 of all young children in the United States today. And not only do these young children make up a significant proportion of young children, but their growth has been very rapid. In fact, children of immigrants have accounted for all of the net growth among the young child population since 1990. And the overwhelming majority of these young children, 94%, are U.S. citizens. But children of immigrants as a whole are more likely than their peers to exhibit several risk factors. They are more likely to live in poverty, at 27% compared to 22% of their native peers. They are also less likely to have health insurance, and they are less likely to be enrolled in preschool. As Caitlin will discuss in a moment, some groups are also more likely to have experienced trauma due to their migration experiences. And in addition to trauma, many young children of immigrants are likely to have been exposed to adverse childhood experiences or ACEs and/or toxic stress. The last thing I wanted to mention is cultural and linguistic diversity. We at MPI have been using the term super diversity to bring attention to the incredible diversity within the immigrant population in the U.S., with hundreds of languages being spoken. And the language profile of the immigrant community is rapidly changing, which makes sufficient translation and interpretation a challenge for many services, especially in the mental health field where skilled interpretation is so necessary. So given this quick backdrop, I'll turn this over to Caitlin to discuss some of the subpopulations within the category of immigrant families and point to some of the specific socio-emotional and mental health concerns that may be an issue within each of these communities, just to get a sense of why we think it's important to call out immigrant families in particular when we talk about infant and early childhood mental health policies and approaches. Caitlin?
Thank you, Maki. First off, I wanted to note that immigrants are, of course, a diverse group with a diverse range of experiences, and people might be affected in different ways and with different intensities by any trauma they may endure. I'm going to highlight today some particular groups of immigrants. I think it's helpful to be aware of these different groups due to their varying migration experiences, as well as some recent policy changes affecting certain groups. I also wanted to note that children can be impacted by these experiences directly and can also be affected by the trauma and stress endured by their caregivers, and we'll talk a bit more about this later. I'm going to start by talking about refugees. Refugees have fled violence or persecution in their home country and may have experienced separation from or loss of their family members, as well as community members. After fleeing, many spend considerable time in difficult situations while in refugee camps or displaced in urban areas before being selected for resettlement in the U.S. Regarding policy changes under the current presidential administration, the federal government's moves to decrease the number of refugees resettled and to expand security checks has led to delays for some who are trying to reunify with family members already here in the U.S. Additionally, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services with the Department of Homeland Security recently announced plans to close its international offices, which would likely lead to further backlogs and delays in family reunification. And this can, of course, be a considerable source of stress for those families who are affected. In addition to refugees arriving through the resettlement program, increasing numbers of families have also sought asylum in the U.S. in recent years, including many families from Central America who travel and cross the U.S.-Mexico border. Asylum seekers may also decide to apply for protection after arriving in the U.S., by plane for instance, or may do so during deportation proceedings. If their claim is approved, they are referred to as asylees. So many asylum seekers have undergone dangerous journeys to reach the U.S., and because it can take months or even years for asylum claims to be resolved, particularly because there is a considerable backlog in the system, these families may also experience stress related to their uncertain legal status once they're here in the U.S. And shifting federal immigration policies, including those meant to deter illegal border crossings and to narrow the grounds for which one can claim asylum, might create additional uncertainty and fear of possible family separation and or deportation. Families where at least one household member does not have legal immigration status in the U.S. are known as mixed status families. And as Maki mentioned, nearly all young children of immigrants are born in the U.S., meaning that in mixed status families with young children, it's likely that the child was born in the U.S. and is therefore a U.S. citizen, while one or both of their parents lacks this legal immigration status. Mixed status families contend with many challenges that can affect their emotional well-being and mental health. For instance, children with unauthorized parents are more likely than their peers with parents who are born in the U.S. or who are legal immigrants to experience psychological distress and economic instability. The lack of legal status also affects parents' eligibility for and likelihood of accessing many public benefits, which in turn affects their young children's access to important supports. And the expansion of immigration enforcement under the Trump administration has increased anxieties around detention, deportation, and family separation among immigrant families with unauthorized members. This has also led some families to be more hesitant to access social services such as health, nutrition, and also early childhood services. I also wanted to mention one other policy change that's affecting some families. Proposed changes to the federal public charge rule are significant revisions to policies regarding the use of public benefits by immigrants. If the new rule goes into effect, it could prevent some applicants from obtaining a green card or from renewing a temporary visa if they are using, have used, or are considered likely to use in the future an expanded list of public benefit programs. It hasn't been implemented yet, but the proposed rule has reportedly already made some immigrants reluctant to access programs such as Medicaid, even for family members who are eligible, due to these anxieties around the immigration consequences. Looking at the immigrant population more broadly, The challenges posed by exposure to discrimination and racism, language barriers, the process of adjusting to a new culture, and the need to negotiate the divide between home and school life affect a wide range of children of immigrants, including those in families where all members have secure legal status. And as I've mentioned, the current situation in which families are living also plays an important role in their mental health and well-being. It's important to note, therefore, that post-migration and acculturative stressors have the potential to considerably affect the mental health and well-being of immigrant and refugee families, and it's essential that these be recognized and addressed alongside other migration-related stressors. This work can include collaboration with other systems and other services serving these families to provide wraparound supports, for instance. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maki.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. So from here, we wanted to talk a little bit about the gaps in services we found in our research before moving on to some possible opportunities to improve and expand support for young children of immigrants and refugees in this realm. So first, I wanted to discuss the likely under-identification of trauma among young children of immigrants, which is due to a number of factors. One issue is that the fact that instruments such as the ACE survey, which screens for adverse childhood experiences, are less likely to identify the types of experiences that young children of immigrants and refugees may be exposed to, due to the fact that they're largely focused on issues within the household environment. So many of the types of migration, resettlement, and acculturation-related issues that Caitlin just raised are not likely to be picked up by a survey like this. Relatedly, many mental health screening tools, including standardized tools that are used to screen recently arrived refugees, are not appropriate or intended for use for young children, which means that there's simply no way for many service providers, such as those working in refugee resettlement agencies, to know whether young children have experienced trauma. A lack of linguistic and cultural competence across services, including early childhood programs, but also mental health services, also means that caretakers, teachers, and other staff in classrooms might miss some of the indications of trauma that Jessica will be discussing, due to a lack of meaningful communication or cultural misunderstandings. Besides this lack of competence, we also know that children of immigrants are less likely to be accessing early childhood services at all, which could otherwise be an important touch point to connect them with other supports, including mental health services. Minority populations, including immigrant populations, are also less likely to seek or be served by mental health services overall, again for a number of reasons, including that lack of meaningful language access or culturally relevant services, as well as cultural stigmas around mental health issues. And finally, as I mentioned in discussing the lack of appropriate screening tools, the refugee resettlement sector overall has very little support in place specifically for young children, especially around provision of socio-emotional and mental health supports for the youngest children alongside their mothers. So with all of that as context and background, what are some practical policy steps that might be taken to support young children of immigrants and refugees through early childhood and other programs and systems? In our brief, we point to these opportunities as well as a few others, which you can read about in greater detail. But first and foremost, we see enormous opportunity and potential in the possibility of expanding trauma-informed supports in early childhood programs, which are uniquely well-placed to serve as a critical connection for young children and families to needed services. If states could provide support and resources for early childhood services to take a more trauma-informed approach and offer access to infant and early childhood mental health consultation, as some states like Maryland have already done, this would be an important and momentous step toward ensuring that young children who've been exposed to trauma are identified in their critical early years and appropriately supported in their healthy socio-emotional development. Home visiting programs are also an important and high potential model to address and mitigate the impacts of trauma for young children of immigrants and refugees through a two-generation approach. I won't say more about this because Amy will speak to this with greater eloquence and expertise, but this is an exciting opportunity that we hope many states and localities will also explore as a means of expanding support by explicitly targeting immigrant and refugee families in their home visiting services. Promoting collaboration between systems that tend to be disjointed, between, for example, the refugee resettlement sector and early childhood systems and programs, as well as health and mental health services, is another opportunity that has not yet been embraced. Past partnerships between Head Start and state refugee resettlement agencies, for example, have been shown to improve outreach and participation among refugee families in high-quality early childhood services. And then finally, going back to the screening issue, having standardized mental health screening processes with instruments that are specifically designed for use in early childhood and validated for use across cultures is critical to ensure that young children are appropriately diagnosed and connected to the supports that they need. So with that, I'm happy now to turn this over to Jessica Dym Bartlett, who will also have many practical recommendations to offer in her presentation. Jessica is co-director of the Early Childhood Program Area for Child Trends and oversees their Massachusetts office and is an expert in a range of research and evaluation methodologies. She's also the lead evaluator for the Child Trauma Training Center at the University of Massachusetts Medical School and serves as the co-chair of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration's National Child Traumatic Stress Network Evaluation Community of Practice. Jessica, we're so grateful to be able to include your depth of knowledge and experience for this conversation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Maki, for that lovely introduction, and hello, everyone. I just wanted to say first that I'm truly grateful that the Migration Policy Institute is holding this timely webinar. It's so important, and that was a beautiful beginning. And while this is certainly a very disturbing topic, I also really view it as a hopeful one because I know there's much that the early childhood field can do to support immigrant and refugee families with young children who have experienced trauma. So today what I'll be doing is just beginning with a basic definition and description of early childhood trauma in general, but also specifically how it relates to refugee and immigrant families with young children. And I'll talk about what they need most to recover and thrive. And finally provide several examples of promising practices in the early childhood field to support these children and families. So first, I thought it would just be useful to begin on the same page with some of the basics, defining and understanding what early childhood trauma is and what it is not. And the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has a nice definition in which it defines early childhood trauma as when a young child experiences an event that causes actual harm or it can pose a serious threat to a child's emotional or physical well-being. And it's just very important to note that trauma is different from experiencing regular life stressors because it's defined by a sense of intense fear and terror and helplessness beyond the normal range of typical childhood experiences. It's also not synonymous with childhood adversity or ACEs. And I was really glad to hear you talk about the limitations of ACEs, even though they've been wonderful in raising awareness and can be useful, but don't include the environmental factors that many immigrant and refugee families face. But childhood adversity and ACEs are different because they may or may not lead to trauma, right? So if you have two children who experience the same event, one may experience it as traumatic and develop even post-traumatic stress symptoms or disorder, while the other child may show some initial signs of distress, but then return to regular functioning, particularly if there is a consistent sensitive caregiver around. So it's just important not to conflate these terms. I know they could be confusing for folks. So potentially traumatic experiences affect a staggering half of all children in the US and disproportionately affects young children. So a couple examples are that children are most at risk for being abused and neglected prior to age 3 and even less than age 1. And young Black and Hispanic infants and toddlers are most likely to live in extreme poverty. So there are many types of experiences that can cause trauma in early childhood, and here are some of the most common: abuse and neglect, serious untreated parental mental illness or substance use disorders, domestic violence, parental incarceration, serious injuries, accidents, or painful medical procedures. However, young children from immigrant and refugee families often face much, much more than that. So immigrant and refugee families tend to experience additional trauma or events that can cause trauma pre-migration, during migration, and post-migration. So while they're in their countries of origin, they may endure war, serious violence, death of a loved one, severe poverty. Once they leave, children are then displaced from their homes, separated from family members, and embark on often dangerous and even life-threatening journeys in some cases. And then once they reach the U.S., we have seen numerous young children separated from family members and held in truly frightening detention conditions. Then post-migration, many families face separation from their communities and traditions, unemployment, poverty, etc. And then finally, I think I would be remiss not to say that in this current political climate, they are just especially likely to experience discrimination. Okay, so thinking about the particular impact of early childhood trauma, I think all of these experiences, when they begin early in life and accumulate, and particularly when perpetrated by someone that is trusted, or where there are multiple traumas over time, which we often refer to as complex trauma, can really wreak havoc on a young child's development. Unfortunately, I think many people assume that young children are pretty immune to these experiences. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say things like, oh, children are resilient. And it is true that, the brain is plastic and that children can do very well despite adversity. But it's often true that they are actually experiencing the most severe of consequences. And early childhood trauma has just been historically overlooked, in part due to many of these myths about the lack of impact on very young children. They won't remember, they'll bounce back, we don't need to worry about it. But actually, clinical research and experience suggests very strongly that young children are deeply affected by witnessing and experiencing violence, for example. So post-traumatic stress symptoms have been observed in infants as young as 3 months of age. And young children really are the most vulnerable to long-term negative effects of trauma. So here you can see how many different domains of development trauma can impact: early brain development, cognition, physical health, emotions, relationships, mental health, behavior. Of course, each child's reaction to these experiences is unique and depends on the nature of trauma, as well as the overall balance of risk and protective factors in the child's life. So it's important not to assume that if a child has had a particular experience, that they necessarily are having a hard time or aren't having a hard time. You really need to assess their functioning. Young children are especially vulnerable to trauma's effects because, as many of you know, I'm sure, this is a sensitive period of brain development, and trauma during this period has been shown to damage the cortex, which facilitates rational thinking and planning, the hippocampus, which facilitates the regulation of our emotions, and the amygdala, which also has an important role in regulating emotions and becomes oversensitive and overactive in those who have suffered early childhood trauma. So it's really not a surprise that young children affected by trauma tend to have difficulty controlling their emotions and responding in rational ways to everyday stress. Children often show signs and symptoms when they're struggling with trauma, and here are a few. But as you read down the list, you probably notice that many of these symptoms occur among children who haven't experienced trauma, and that makes it more complicated. And I think this is often a source of children being overlooked and falling through the cracks or being misdiagnosed. So for instance, trauma is often mistaken for ADHD. But in general, if the symptoms persist beyond a few months and appear especially intense or are new, that tends to be a sign that the child is in need of trauma-informed support. Caring for a child affected by trauma can be extremely challenging for parents, but also early childhood workers, right? Often because children's trauma reactions take the form of challenging behaviors. Typically, children who are externalizing, kind of acting out, are the ones who are identified, but there are also children who, whose challenging behaviors take the form of complete withdrawal. And in turn, caregivers can really become stressed out by having to deal with that on a regular basis, and that can lead to insensitive caregiving and parenting. And then often young immigrant and refugee children and their caregivers have been involved in similar or the same traumatic events. And there's a very interesting body of research showing that the negative reactions from either the parent or the child can intensify symptoms in the other. And although there isn't extensive research in that area, one might naturally assume that that's true for early childhood caregivers who might have their own reactions to trauma, and that can really affect children and vice versa, right? And understandably, when family members are traumatized, their emotional resources are limited. And so conflicts within the parenting couple, family, the sibling relationship can develop and often do. So these are multiply stressed families often. So next, I thought I would talk a little bit about what early childhood providers, programs, and systems can do to support young immigrants and refugees who've been exposed to trauma. And I wanted to make this as concrete as possible. But first, I think it's important for early childhood providers to understand the needs of young traumatized children. And there is a large body of research that shows that children who do well despite trauma have at least one stable and nurturing adult in their lives. And that's probably not big news to many of you. But also that environments are particularly attentive to safety and trust, because safe environments can restore a child's feeling of control and predictability through consistent routines and expectations. And when we make environments safe for young children who are traumatized, one of the things we need to do is to limit their exposure to trauma triggers. Smells, sounds, sudden movements, reminders of the event. And that actually does require a different type of care. And so that means that adults may need to change their own behaviors and their own environments. So for instance, a typical practice that's taught to early care and education teachers is to, when a child is acting out, is to get down to the child's level, make eye contact, maybe place a gentle hand on the shoulder in order to calm the child down. But for a child who has experienced trauma, let's say physical abuse or violence, even just a touch of a shoulder or a look in the eye can really be triggering and exacerbate their negative behaviors and feelings. So care has to be tailored with care to the specific needs of traumatized children, and each child might have different triggers that you need to be able to identify and address. They also tend to need help with self-regulation and social emotional skills, largely because of some of the effects we just discussed about on brain development. And so providers, parents, and other caregivers can really help children by practicing self-regulation skills, often through what's referred to as co-regulation, but nurturing interactions in which adults are modeling and coaching how to self-regulate when children are facing stressful everyday situations. And you don't want to do this when children are completely overwhelmed. You want to do this when a stressor is beginning to disturb a child, because once they're kind of in full fight or flight mode, this really isn't helpful. And of course, it's also important to pay attention to other skills that they need to succeed in school. So for instance, gaining language skills not only helps children keep from falling behind their peers and getting ready for school, but also helps them express and cope with difficult emotions. And young children who don't speak English may at first really feel much more comfortable doing so in their first language. So that's something to be sensitive to as well, even if they have proficiency in English. And of course, early childhood programs and systems can use these and other strategies as part of a larger trauma-informed care approach. So you may have heard this term floating around, trauma-informed care or trauma-informed approach. And really it's based on the idea that we know that there is no one system, there's no one intervention, there's no one person, service, et cetera, that can fully address childhood trauma. So a systemic approach is really needed, which is what's often called trauma-informed care or trauma-informed approach. in which early childhood programs and providers engage families and collaborate with community service providers in mental health, but also early intervention, many other services, so that everyone who comes in contact with a child, a parent, a teacher, a therapist, a bus driver, a cafeteria worker, everyone has an idea of what the impact of trauma is and what helps children to recover. And in trauma-informed care, and this is defined, this particular definition comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, all adults then become capable of recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma. So when young children are acting out, adults are able to see that these behaviors are normal reactions to trauma and not intentional misbehavior. So it becomes more about what happened to you and how can we support you than what's wrong with you. And in turn, they're better able to respond in trauma-informed ways and to resist or avoid re-traumatizing children, which can happen inadvertently. So thinking about what early childhood programs can do, one thing that's really critical is to make sure that all staff learn about the impact of trauma on children and families and talk to each other about how to implement trauma-informed care in different ways, and from leadership to everyday practitioners. And they can do lots of things in the classroom, lots of things in home visiting, lots of things in other services to create warm, inviting, nurturing, safe spaces that really allow dysregulated children a place to calm themselves. And staff can really notice and remove trauma triggers. So for example, in one center that I was working in as an infant mental health consultant, there was a cafeteria worker who used to come by and show the children ingredients for their lunch every day. And the children loved it. They could see all the different ingredients, guess what they were going to eat, talk about how food, was made, where it comes from. But one young girl who we subsequently found out, had experienced starvation, was really triggered every time she saw food but couldn't have it. And so it was just really important for them to stop this practice for a while until she could heal. And they ended up still exposing other children to it by bringing the children to the food. So there may be accommodations like that that are really critical and can make a big difference in children's lives. So we want to really create a regular routine for children so children and families know what to expect. That may mean making a regular place to meet for each activity, certainly during transitions, using carpet squares, signals that can work for kids without using words so that kids who are either reluctant to use language or don't speak English can understand. Singing the same welcome and goodbye songs, and even better in multiple languages, using the same hand gestures to accompany words so children who speak other languages can understand. And just to maintain a general awareness that children and their families probably will have a general distrust of power, authority, programs, and government assistance. It's just natural and adaptive response given what they've been through, which requires quite a bit of patience and support and understanding on our part. Okay, so creating an inclusive environment is important, including resources, decor, materials that reflect the diversity of all children and families, offering information in different languages, displaying community resources in different languages, making books and materials available that speak to the immigrant and refugee experience, and really inviting families in ways that they feel comfortable to share traditions. And that may look really different for different families. So there are a number of very promising approaches to working with young children exposed to trauma, although few have been studied enough to become evidence-based, and that's a real need in the field. And we don't have time to go over them all, but I've included a link to the brief that we wrote that describes them in detail, and I'll point that out at the end. Some of these interventions have been done in early care and education. So Trauma Smart is an early education mental health partnership that was developed in Head Start classrooms. Let's Connect is a parenting intervention that helps caregivers identify and respond to children's emotional needs and behavior. Safe Start provides early intervention support for infants and toddlers who have been abused and neglected. And infant and early childhood mental health consultation which Maki and Caitlin mentioned before, is a strategy that's now operating in more than half of all states, in which mental health professionals work with early care and education professionals or home visitors and programs, and has been shown to be quite effective. Then there are home visiting approaches. I'll leave that to Amy, since that's where she's going to pick up. And professional development and training, which is really critical. And one resource to know about is that the National Child Traumatic Stress Network actually has training centers all around the country, and many of them focus on the needs of young immigrant and refugee families. And those that don't, we are connected to each other through a network. And so we can get that information and provide free training. And then finally, through systems of endorsement, and such as the Michigan Association of Infant Mental Health can be a good way to prepare providers effectively for this work. So lastly, I just wanted to make sure that we talked a little bit about partnering with community providers. So there are many different really interesting, innovative approaches. One is the Child Trauma Training Center in Massachusetts at the UMass Medical School, which has a free call-in line that anyone can call, a parent, a teacher, a therapist, to get an appointment for a child with an evidence-based trauma therapist nearby. And evidence-based trauma treatments like the ones that are listed are also available, though I would recommend seeking providers who really have expertise also working with immigrant and refugee populations whenever possible. And always very important to keep in mind that there's a lot of stigma associated with mental health services in some cultures, and including ours. Really important to consider that with families and help them overcome both the kind of psychological and cultural and practical barriers like transportation and childcare in order to access services. And then finally, Help Me Grow promotes early identification and supports for children at risk for developmental and behavioral problems. And the Safe Babies Court Teams is a really innovative model because it brings together child welfare agencies, mental health agencies, community organizations, early childhood serving systems together to help infants and toddlers. So finally, I just wanted to make sure you had some good resources. The second resource listed has all of the early childhood interventions described in full detail, and I think, so feel free to peruse that. And I will end there, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for this excellent presentation. Just so you all know, we will have those resource slides along with the rest of the presentation available on our website in case we have participants who are frantically taking notes as we move forward. And I'll just remind everyone that we will be fielding questions in the last minutes of the call, so please do continue to send those in. But this sets us up perfectly now to hear about successful on-the-ground efforts to address these issues. I'm excited now to formally introduce Amy Hilado. Amy is an assistant professor of social work at Northeastern Illinois University, as well as the founding manager of the RefugeeOne Wellness Program, which she'll be discussing today. She is an academic, a researcher, and a clinician who specializes in immigration trauma and immigrant and refugee mental health, and we're so fortunate to have her join us today. Over to you, Amy.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, and I echo the gratitude for this opportunity to speak, to be able to share what we are doing in the field, and also the interest in the field. Building on the remarks of my peers, I want to speak to the intergenerational impact of immigration trauma and the way we can leverage early childhood prevention services, specifically home visiting, to buffer its impact. And so when we think about families that are impacted by immigration trauma, families experience a particular stress when they flee their home countries in search of opportunities to rebuild their lives with safety and dignity. And these images on the screen offer a glimpse into the experiences of dangerous journeys to uncertain futures and years of waiting for a resolution. Such experiences are reflected in the themes that we're seeing in the field. In my practice, we encounter parents who communicate the fear and uncertainty for the future and the continued concerns for their safety, even though they're here in the United States. And while grateful to be in the U.S., they miss their homeland, their culture, the loved ones they left behind, and this contributes to feelings of loneliness as well as homesickness. And as they have access to news of what's happening back home in real time, whether it's news networks, Facebook, WhatsApp, they feel guilt for those who continue to suffer in their homeland. All of this has a cumulative effect on the family and specifically the parent-child relationship. And so I offer this slide. You'll see the symptoms that we commonly see amongst our adults reflecting this impact of immigration trauma: the prolonged sadness, the poor coping, easily triggered individuals who are anxious, have difficulty concentrating. These are all additional stressors that can make adjustment and navigating life in a new country even more challenging. A hallmark of post-traumatic stress disorder is this difficulty concentrating, the hypervigilance, that memory loss. Now imagine you're a newly arrived refugee or immigrant trying to learn how to read or speak in English and navigate public transportation. Clearly, there are going to be adjustment challenges as a result of immigration trauma. And so as we think about mental health, we know that mental well-being is important for all of us. But for those who are forcibly displaced, whose migration stories are threaded with trauma experiences, mental well-being is that much more critical, yet there are challenges in getting supports to them. What we know on the ground is that many times mental health is associated with something negative. So you're crazy, right? It's a product of moral failing. Others only understand it in terms of physical symptoms, so chronic headaches, back pain, heart palpitation, and in most cases, mental health is a private matter, something that you only discuss with family, maybe a religious leader, small members in your community. Sadly, what we're seeing is that some symptoms are so pervasive in the communities that it's actually seen as normal, that everyone has nightmares, everyone is sad, everyone can't sleep. And such normalization makes seeking treatment that much harder. What we think about when we think about the adults, when adults do not access proper mental health care, we see those struggles passed on to the children. Trauma has this uncanny ability to freeze the parent-child relationship, especially when parent availability is compromised. And so as a result, we are seeing children who struggle in the absence of parents who cannot model this compassion, attuned communication. They can't model self-regulation or appropriate coping. And this leads to all the impacts that Jess had just shared. So if I think about this context, there's much that we know about how to address immigrant and refugee mental health. We know that cumulative immigration experiences will affect mental functioning. We know that the overall adjustment and health outcomes can impact an entire family if we don't address infant early childhood mental health as well as adult mental health. And so we know that family-centered approaches are critical. We also know that new arrivals are less likely to seek formal services for a number of reasons, whether it's the priority of other needs, finding that job, learning the language, making sure that they can pay their rent, to the misinformation about mental health, Western models of treatment being inappropriate, or even just lack of knowledge about what's out there. That's in the space. And given the current socio-political climate, as Jess alluded to, the rhetoric that we use around immigrant populations, there's a reluctance, a real reluctance to seek services and engage in unfamiliar programs because of that fear of identification. So for us, our charge is to explore pathways of supporting developmental outcomes for young children and mental well-being for our refugee and immigrant families. And within early childhood education systems, we have an opportunity to do this. This is where home visiting can play a role. Our efforts to support trauma-experienced families, we know that supporting developmental and mental health outcomes, they don't need to be separate agendas. The two are absolutely parallel and can be met with what I like to call trauma-informed home visiting. Home visiting works because the delivery mechanism of being in the home, that really does matter. It removes the barriers of families having to find the service, to navigate transportation, and what you're going to see is the true needs of the family because they're more comfortable in their home. We reduce the fear of families encountering federal agents by being in their home, and it's also an opportunity to really hone in on what are the additional needs of that family, both clinical and non-clinical. And second, the nature, the priorities of home visiting services allows for those gains in child development, but also potentially promoting health outcomes as well. And so I want to take a moment to share information about the Wellness Program, my program. We were the first mental health program in the state of Illinois to receive an Illinois State Board of Education home visiting grant to deliver services, home visiting services to expectant moms and families under the age, with children under the age of 3. We started this program in 2016, and we used the baby talk model with our team of 4 clinicians, 5 refugee home visitors, psychiatrists, and our dedicated team of interpreters that help us provide both clinical and non-clinical services. We chose the baby talk model for its reputation of being a relational approach to engaging trauma-experienced, culturally diverse families. It's a promising practice model that has been recognized by SAMHSA's National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices, and it's been around since 1986, with over 1,400 professionals trained across 32 states and Canada. In Illinois, we have about over 100 publicly funded programs, and more than half of the children receiving home visiting in our state through these publicly funded programs, they're getting the Baby Talk model, and I put the link there for the model itself. What's core in the Baby Talk model is the relationship. It has extensive early childhood curriculum and a flexible approach to engaging families, but what's key is that it puts the parent as expert, leading the engagement and forming this home visitor parent collaborative partnership to support both child and parent goals. And so I really do believe it's actually this approach, how we are with families through the Baby Talk model, that actually successfully allows us to engage immigrant and refugee families. And keep in mind, most of the families we serve in the wellness program have never heard of home visiting because it doesn't exist in their countries. How we make it work is how we are in that space. And so when we think about the goals of home visiting, specifically to the Baby Talk model, they take a developmental parenting approach. So you're never alone with just the child. It is the parent-child dyad. And we support parent mastery through facilitating parent-child interactions. We observe, narrate behavior, very similar to kind of ABC catch-up, where we narrate behavior in real time. We listen and engage parents in trying to understand the meaning-making that they have around their child's development. And there's a ton of information sharing and reflecting. We do this so that we can support parent confidence and have meaningful goal setting, not only for the child, but for the parent and the family. Ongoing case management is key as well, and we know that all of this in general is important to strengthening not only the parent-child relationship, but promoting child development and helping these families navigate their community independent. But none of this change is going to happen unless you have an attuned relationship, and that's really key for immigrant and refugee groups. And so in the wellness program, we use the Baby Talk model in addition to informing and training our home visitors around mental health terminology, trauma-informed practice, and how to look for those common symptoms that warrant a referral. Trauma-informed home visiting can actually be a pathway to supporting mental health and child outcomes when you do it right. Because oftentimes when you do it right, it shares the common denominators of culturally sensitive therapy. That is, you dedicate the time to build the trust, to share information, and you build a supportive relationship that is the foundation for healing. We're not saying home visiting is therapy, so I want to be clear on that. But what I will say is home visiting is a culturally sensitive approach to engaging families and supporting them in a way that's experienced as therapeutic. That the goals of home visiting can be realized in addition to supporting adjustment to life in a new country, which is so critical. And what it also does is it gives a pathway to talking about mental health in a safe way, removing the stigma, removing the fear, and really getting families to appropriate services more effectively. We saw that on the ground, that our home visitors could talk about mental health in a way that wasn't scary and then refer accordingly. Some families absolutely said, no, I don't want to be in therapy in addition to home visiting, but they also remarked in the same breath that they felt better knowing that they were going to have the consistent support of their home visitor. So while we were seeing gains in the field, we wanted to quantify that, and our funders, the Illinois State Board of Ed, as well as Baby Talk, were equally interested in understanding impact because we were the first mental health program to get a home visiting grant. And so as such, we completed a randomized controlled trial, gold standard in evidence-based research, with 200 families recruited, 12 nationalities represented, 9 languages spoken. We're so proud of that. We looked at 3 different dimensions: child outcomes, parent outcomes, family outcomes. We used some of the standard tools you know in the field, ages and stages, preschool language scales, parent stress index for the parent, as well as a refugee health screener that looks specific to trauma. And we also looked at economic self-sufficiency in the form of employment and how these folks navigated referrals in the community, as well as positive parenting skills. To give you a glimpse of who we had, a lot of diversity. So most of our participants across the sample of 200 were from Burma across several ethnic groups, Rohingya, Karen, and Chin. Majority of our sample were refugees, but we also had representation of those of undocumented status from Mexico and Colombia. Majority of our population, 130 participants, were displaced out of their country of origin for at least 5 years, with 87 being displaced for more than 10 years. So consider the trauma implications of those protracted periods of displacement. More than half of the sample had less than a high school education. Overwhelming English language learners in our sample, 175 participants, and we were serving a low-income group. 188 of our sample were receiving some form of public benefits, whether it was WIC, food stamps, Medicaid, refugee cash assistance. And this is what we learned, accounting for baseline measures. statistically significant findings in key areas of child development, and effect sizes across all other dimensions in a desired direction. So children receiving baby talk home visiting, clear statistically significant gains in social, emotional, and language development. Parents getting baby talk home visiting services were less stressed, showed less stress symptoms, and evidence of coping better with their trauma symptoms after the 12 months of treatment. Families receiving baby talk home visiting more likely to identify needs and navigate community resources, and also more likely to be employed with either part-time or full-time employment. And we associate this with likely they're having more support from their home visitor asking questions about how to find a job. And we even have preliminary data saying that we're seeing a positive increase in parenting strategies that we know are critical for development. The full study findings are currently in the pipeline for publication, but you certainly can email me if you want more details. And so if we take all of this together, I want to leave you all with this, that we have to understand the impact of immigration trauma amongst refugee and immigrant populations if we want them to succeed and thrive, so not simply survive in our country. Home visiting is a potential that can produce significant developmental outcomes for this group. And we can also see that, again, in the nuanced available resources in kind of the field now. But home visiting is certainly a promising practice we want to consider. Moreover, we can support mental well-being if we equip frontline early childhood professionals with trauma-informed mental health knowledge so we can expand and support our network. The greater our understanding of immigration trauma, I think it's an opportunity to build our early childhood systems in a coordinated effort to really support these groups. And thank you for your time. Let's open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Amy. This is such important and inspiring work that you're doing, and it spurred a lot of questions and conversation among participants. We have received permission to go a few minutes over time. I'm sorry we're running a little late, but I think we've had a lot of questions come in, and I'm going to start with one specific to Amy's presentation, which was a question, Amy, about whether or not you've seen any difference in effects or impacts of the program depending on whether you had staff that spoke the family's home language versus using an interpreter.
Sure. So we've had a mix, right? So we have home visitors that were refugees themselves that were trained in the baby talk model, but we also have therapists native born to Illinois that work with interpreters. We actually have seen gains in both, and I know that that question has come up in the past. It comes back to the approach and the baby talks approach to really engaging families, the intentional time spent in understanding and building that foundation. Yes, it takes a little bit longer when you have a home visitor that doesn't speak the language, but when the relationship is at the focus of the engagement, we still are seeing the same outcomes. In the study, we did have 2 home visitors that were not refugees themselves, and we saw gains across the entire sample.
Great, thanks so much, Amy. And I'm actually going to combine 2 questions here together and first give Jessica a chance to answer and then also give Amy a chance to chime in, as I think you'll both have information to share. So we had a question about what kinds of screening tools might be effective for use across cultures and what kinds of screening tools, Amy, in your case, you're using in your program, if you could speak a little bit more about that. And then relatedly, we had a question about how providers can assess or identify early childhood trauma, for example, those working with WIC programs or daycare providers, if it's not in the scope of their work or expertise. So Jessica, could you speak to those questions first, and then we'll give Amy a chance to chime in?
Absolutely. Just go back. So the first one was relating to, just say it one more time, I'm sorry.
So what kinds of screening tools, if any, you know of that are appropriate for use across cultures and languages?
So this is really an area that we need to expand the field. There are, first of all, very few good trauma measures for very young children, and then secondarily, certainly that has been tested with different cultural groups. So what I would recommend is looking up the particular screening tools. And so, for instance, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, if you go onto their website, they have complete worksheets where they show all different tools, how they work, who they've been tested with, if they work with particular populations, what age groups they use. But in general, one of the really important pieces is to not just assess trauma exposure, and that's one of the things I think we get into trouble with ACEs screening. And someone I noticed in the chat box, ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and there was an original study done in the mid-1990s in which they found that there were adult outcomes that were very poor in relation. But when you assess exposure through something like ACEs or any other screener and you don't look at how the child is actually doing, you're really missing a critical piece of the picture. While I very much would advocate for screening for early adversity, I would propose that it's actually a three-step process. One is understanding what they've experienced. Two is understanding how they're doing given their experiences, and specifically around are they having trauma-related symptoms. And then the third is really looking at the whole child, so conducting a full developmental assessment so that you can understand what their strengths and weaknesses are, and you're not just taking a deficits perspective and assuming that exposure to trauma is somehow destiny, which it really isn't.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. Amy, is there anything you'd like to add?
Screening that's available. What I will say that there's screenings that we do just universally across all adults in the wellness program. We know that in the wellness program we are serving trauma-experienced refugees, so we use standardized tools amongst the adults, universal screening for the adults to get a sense of their functioning. The Refugee Health Trauma Screener, RHS-15, is used nationally in a number of programs to understand specific trauma experiences to refugees. But when it comes to screening with our children, we definitely do rely on the Ages and Stages questionnaire. We find that that's powerful. And then in combination, we really want to think about assessment and screening from a global perspective because, again, I think these families function very differently, and some of these children are not necessarily normed for the populations we're seeing in our state, even across the country.
Thanks, Amy. And this is Maki, I'll just add on my end that in terms of the refugee experience, for recently arrived refugees, the RHS-15, which is the screening tool that's used in many but not all states to screen for symptoms of mental health issues, it is validated across cultures, but again, is only geared toward adults. And so we're advocating for an instrument that would be validated for use for young children as well. The next question that I wanted to, again, pass to both of you, and I'll maybe have Amy speak to this first. There's a question about what kinds of professional development or supports might be available or successful in preventing secondary trauma for those who are interacting with families who've experienced trauma.
It's a very good question. I think that the field, as we think about compassion fatigue and we think about this secondary traumatic stress, it certainly is there. I know that there are a number of groups that we work with locally here in Illinois that are working on that. The key to this, if I'm going to just say not thinking about big systems that are doing these trainings, but what we're doing on the ground here in Illinois across our refugee consortium is really thinking about reflective practice, that when we think about and even integrating mindfulness practice in our work, that idea of being able to be more responsive versus reactive. And when we can do that very well, we can then hold our families who could then hold the children. That's something that is more intentional. It's certainly a need in the field, but I do know resources are coming out of the National Traumatic Stress Network, Lurie Children's Hospital, and also the Illinois Refugee Mental Health Task Force that was developed, one of the groups that I formed, to really support refugee mental health providers in this area. To go back again, we speak a lot about reflective practice, mindfulness practice, training, intentional training in this area to address that compassion fatigue.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Jessica, was there anything you wanted to add on that?
Sure. I think one of the really critical pieces is to institutionalize systems for addressing secondary traumatic stress. We often, as providers and as parents, caregivers of any sort say, we'll get to ourselves last. And really the science says that if we are in better condition and emotionally more stable and well, then we can provide better care. So it's actually a pretty serious issue that we need to address. And so in early childhood systems, I couldn't agree with Amy more in terms of reflective practice, but that means having really investing in supervision and making sure that supervisors are trained to provide reflective supervision, that is provided to direct service providers regularly enough so that they can talk about issues that arise. And then to really talk with staff and different programs about what works, because as you know, each individual human being, uses different techniques to be able to decompress. One person might go to therapy, another person might practice mindfulness, another person might just need, exercise. But to really think about integrating that into regular practice as part of trauma-informed care.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jessica. And I think we're going to have to close with one broad question, which I will open to both of you. And it's a question about what kinds of practical recommendations might you offer about helping families to overcome some of the cultural stigmas and fears that I think all of us mentioned that are related to mental health services.
Sure. So I can take a stab at this first. We've been very intentional in our refugee resettlement program and also in our community to really provide a lot of education about what mental health is. Part of it is the words are scary. And so what we do is instead of just saying the word mental health, we try and frame it in a way that's accessible. The way we describe mental health to our community leaders, our refugee arrivals, our immigrant service folks that we serve, we say that mental health is about feeling all your emotions, feeling happy, sad, feeling angry and frustrated, but not being dominated by any one of them. We describe it as being able to make good decisions, have good relationships, to be able to go about your day without struggling. And when it's time, when you feel that that's the case, you're really struggling to get by every day, that's when we have resources for them. When we frame the language in a way that's accessible, it's about health, it's about well-being, it's about feeling good, rather than it's scary, something's wrong with you, that you need services. When we do that, when we make the language accessible, that's when we see folks really coming forward, asking for help, and being ready to engage. And that has to happen at all levels, with refugees, across staff training, across leaders, that we really do need to work collectively and in a coordinated way to remove that stigma at every turn that we can.
Thank you, Amy. Any last words, Jessica?
I would just say I think some of the strategies that we have, like home visiting and infant and early childhood mental health consultation, are really helpful that way, because people come to families. It doesn't ask families to walk into a mental health agency, which is a much more difficult place to begin when you're frightened or put off. And so then families can really see what it looks like, and it becomes less scary and less stigmatized.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm very sorry to say that that's about all the time that we have for this discussion today. To those of you who have questions that have remained unanswered, I do apologize, as we simply received too many to address in the time we had, but we will follow up with you with responses via email, and our emails are here as well in case you wanted to follow up with any of us. I also want to let you know that the slides and audio from today's webinar will be available in the next day or two at the link on the previous slide. Finally, for any reporters on the call who have further questions, please reach out to our Communications Director, Michelle Middlestat, at 202-266-1910. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and especially to our speakers, Jessica and Amy, for your excellent presentations. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.